So now let's take a closer look at a couple different types of above ground storage tanks. In the classroom we discussed a multitude of the varieties you would run into doing an STI inspection. Here we're going to look at 4 specific tanks. Let's review a couple of the items that would be indicators that would lead us to determine what type of tank of the UL rating it is specifically. So first we want to figure out if it's single wall or double wall. Single wall tanks versus double wall tanks will have certain indications like an emergency vent. Again, remember that primary emergency vents for some tanks could be long bolt manways. So we want to look for emergency vents. We want to look for a tank interstice to see if there is a secondary. Those come in all shapes and sizes. So we want to look for that. That will be a good indication. Second thing will be the tank supports. So does it have a saddle? Is it welded? Is it bolted? Is it a leg? What is it constructed of? Those will be indications about the UL rating of the tank. Next, we will want to see the thickness potentially of the exterior of the steel. If it doesn't have steel, obviously like this tank here behind me, it might have a concrete encasement, so that would be pretty obvious. But if it has steel, we want to try to figure out potentially the thickness of the steel. Those will be indications again of the UL rating. So let's look a little bit closer into these 4 tanks that we have here and identify each one, not by looking right at the label if we have one, but those 3 or 4 factors that we talked about. So let's take a closer look at this tank that we have here. We're going to discuss the features of this tank so then we can identify what type of tank it actually is. So first off, right out of the gate, I just see a normal vent. This will be a duplex bushing for supply and return for like a heating oil tank. It's identified as a number 2 fuel oil, so that kind of tells me it might be more of a heating oil tank. I have a level gauge and then another plugged up bung. So I'm looking at that. It does not appear to be a double wall tank at all. Right out of the gate, I don't see any emergency vents. Those are indications that would lead me to maybe think it's another type of UL rating. So it looks like a single wall tank. The end of the tank, the shell of the tank has a stamped, this is a stamped end, and this is called an ob-round or oblong tank, ob-round tank. So it's not a cylindrical with the stamped. And then I actually can see stamped into the steel, I can see the gauge of the steel on this one. There isn't any other stamps or embossed labels or stickers on this tank. I just see that it's heating oil, I see it's combustible, so it really doesn't tell me the UL rating. But right now I know that it's single wall, I know that it's 12 gauge, I know that it's a stamped end, which means it's thinner gauge steel. I also can see that there's 4 posts that are holding this up. So this is pretty common for a UL 80 275 gallon tank. So this is your very, very common heating oil tank. These are also used for used oil and possibly sometimes diesel for maybe an engine or a generator. But UL 80 would be the branding of this style tank. Pretty straightforward, not too much to inspect or get into beyond that. And they can also be mounted in this vertical position or in the horizontal position. So they could be over on their side, and then all the fittings would actually be welded in the top of this instead of the top of this side as opposed to down here, and the legs would be on the underside. So those are the 2 typical configurations for this style tank. And again, predominantly used for used oil, motor oils, or heating oils or number 2 fuel oils. So let's take a closer look at this tank that we have here. This is a rectangular tank. It's just sitting on C-channel supports. It's welded. I can clearly see nice good steel. This has a good thick coating on it. So I know that it's got more than 1 coat of paint. That would be kind of an indication leaning me towards a 142 or a 2085 tank when I see a good thick coating of paint on this. I immediately see 1 emergency vent back here. I see some plugged other fittings. I see a level gauge, and then I have a spill bucket that's welded to the tank, and then I have a vent. So I see 1 larger opening. That tells me it's probably the emergency vent for the primary. I see 1 vent. So right now I'm thinking this is a single wall tank. I don't see any secondary. I don't see any different weld seams that would extend the primary of the tank. So I definitely think that this is a single wall tank. So I know that it's not a 2085 tank, a UL 2085 tank. It's not a protected tank. It looks like a UL 142 single wall tank. The steel, there's no other stamps, there's no other signs or any indications that would indicate the manufacturer, the thickness of the steel, or anything else. So pretty straightforward with a single wall UL 142 tank, what to look for, what to inspect, and there you go. Let's take a closer look at this tank ID tag. In this one we can see that it is a little harder to read. However, we can make out the UL stamp in the left top corner, but we don't see a 142 or 2085 or any other indication of what UL rating it is. As we look a little closer, we can see that it does say above ground storage tank for flammable liquids. So we know that it's either a 142 or a 2085. And then we would have to look a little bit further on the tank to identify the components to see if there is the lightweight concrete or concrete encasement to see if it's a 2085. So this is something that you might see in the field, and they're not always easy to read. So now let's take a closer look at this tank. This is a rectangular horizontal tank. It appears to be right out of the gate a double wall tank, right? One of the first things we want to do is identify is it single wall or double wall. I do have an ID chart over there, but I don't want to look at that right now. I just want to observe and look at all the components on this tank. So I see 2 emergency vents. I also see 2 primary vents. So now I'm kind of suspicious. That's odd. And then I also have a 6-inch plugged port back here that it looks like when they installed the tank, they left the shipping plug in. This, I can immediately see as an inspector, I would remove this and I would look down inside and I can see the concrete that's in between this tank. So now I'm immediately knowing that this is a not a steel secondary. It's a fiberglass coated with a concrete encased tank. So this is a CE-AST per STI. So the problem is that this tank was set up with 2 emergency vents and 2 primary vents, and then the secondary they just left sealed. They never actually installed an emergency vent on it. This is actually a 2-compartment double wall concrete encased tank. So this is a unique one, but again, different than the other ones that we've been looking at. So UL 2085, that means it's a protected tank, so it's protected from vehicles, ballistic, and 2-hour fire rating. So these are great for a lot of different situations. If you're close to property lines, you might want to see different circumstances based upon maybe if it's holding gas, close to the property line, close to the building. These are other things that I would kind of lean towards identifying why this may be a 2085 tank versus a 142. Definitely would not want to put gas in a UL 80 tank, can't. So again, 2 emergency vents. This is a little bit of a trick tank. That's why we wanted to kind of cover it. 2 emergency vents. Most people would immediately think, oh, well, this is a double wall tank because I see 2 emergency vents. It's actually 2 compartments. If we look a little bit closer at the tank ID chart, we can clearly see it's a Hoover containment and it has the stamp UL 2085 on it. But again, a lot of times I inspect tanks, this chart would not be on the tank, so I need to look at all the other factors to identify it. The other reason that I can see that this is a double wall tank is right here I have a leak indicator. This has a little float that goes to the bottom all the way down. If the primary tank, either of the 2 primary tanks leaked and went into the secondary, this little indicator would have a float and the float would go up and it would kind of indicate right in this little sight glass here. A float would come up and it's red and it would indicate that there's a leak. So several different factors identified it's a double wall tank. I can tell it's a concrete encased. 2 reasons: I took off the shipping plug, looked inside and saw the concrete. I also see the different emergency vents and the primary vents, and I happen to have an ID chart on this one that helps me identify it. So a lot of things that help me narrow in on what type of tank this is. So here's a closer look at the concrete encased above ground storage tank ID tag. This is clearly a Hoover containment UL 2085 tank. Now let's take a closer look at this tank. This is our favorite 5,000 gallon tank we use a lot here at MPTI. So we're again on the safety grading above the tank. So let's, again, first, right out of the gate, let's figure out if it's a single wall or a double wall tank. So we want to identify some venting. So I see my primary vent here. I see 2 emergency vents. So immediately I'm thinking primary vent for the main part of the tank. I don't have a long bolt manway. The lid is bolted tight. And my 2 emergency vents, I could lift up each one of these, shine my flashlight down and figure out which one is which. This one, when I lift it up and I look down inside, I can see that this goes down into the primary. When I go over and look at this one, and I lift it up and examine it and look down inside, I can see the inside interstitial space between the two tanks, and I see the steel surface. So I'm not seeing the lightweight concrete. So immediately I'm knowing that this is a double wall tank, and it immediately appears to be a UL 142. So another indication to figure out if it's single wall or double wall is I would come down here to the end of the tank, one end to the other, and I would look for my interstice. In this case, it has a nice riser coming up. I see a sensor. So again, two indications, double wall tank. Two emergency vents. I can see when I look down through that one, I can see the interstitial space, and I have a secondary riser for the interstice with a sensor. Very easy to determine this is a double wall tank. So once I know that it's a double wall tank, is it a 142 or is it a 2085? 2085 is the protected tank, has the fire rating, the ballistic, and the vehicle. I can see that there is not concrete in this. If we went down below and we looked at the supports, we would want to look and see if the saddles are welded to the tank, and some other indications to determine that. But again, I visually can see that there is not the concrete between the two tanks. Another thing that you can kind of look at, if we didn't have some of these other indications, is the thickness of the steel. Is I can see the weld joints here. So let's say somebody took an underground tank and maybe tried to convert it into an above ground tank. I would be able to look at the thickness of the steel and try to determine some factors by looking through those things as well. So again, pretty simple on this tank. It's set up for easy access and inspection. Real quickly, we ruled out, UL 80, 2085. It's a 142 double wall. So there you go.